A nightmare of a series for Brewers pitching in New York, and unfortunately more of the same in the home opener. However, the Brewers did bounce back in their final two games of a three-game set over the Kansas City Royals to pick up their first series win of the year and improve to now 2-4 in the record column. This is the Brewer Fanatic podcast. We've got all of week one action to break down, most of week one, the first full week, I guess. We got week's worth of games in, basically, and we'll break it all down for you here. Some things that we've seen from this first week, some things to look into a little more, some things to be concerned about, some things to be a little more optimistic about. We'll dive into all of it here tonight. Jack Stern, joined by my co-host Spencer Michaelis. Spencer, if you had to sum up this first week of regular season games in one or two words, how would you do it? I'm putting you on the spot here to start out.
Mostly not fun. I added a word.
Not's a very short word. I'll let that one slide. Mostly not fun. A little more fun once we got towards the end of that Royals series, though, but we might as well start with the not fun part. So we broke down the Brewers' opening day loss to the Yankees. Ho-hum, pretty standard loss. It was, a 2-4 final in that one. But things got a little bit worse after that. The Brewers allowing the Yankees to score 20 runs in game 2 and then 12 runs in game 3. Milwaukee allowing 15 home runs to the Bronx Bombers in a 3-game series. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. We'll break down kind of why we think this happened as we get later into the show, but just for the purposes of recapping this really quick, we'll try to breeze through the horror show that we had in New York. Nestor Cortez and Connor Thomas both getting hit very hard in game 2, combining to allow 16 of those 20 runs. Both of those guys, I believe, I don't have the line score up in front of me now, but I believe 2 innings, 8 runs for both of those guys, if memory serves correctly. And then in game 3, Aaron Savali getting the start in that one. The Brewers could have really used some length from him to try to stabilize things. Instead, he was also hit hard too, allowing 3 home runs, only lasting, I believe, 3 innings as well before he had to leave with a hamstring strain, which ended up landing him on the 15-day injured list. So the Brewers now down another starting pitcher. Kind of hard to believe that with where they were at as far as that starting group goes entering spring training, they ended up 3 days into the season with only 2 of those guys left in their starting rotation. Kind of a, I don't want to say worst case scenario because it can always get worse, but in terms of things you could have realistically anticipated happening, that's definitely on the extreme end, if you ask me. So the Brewers, not great stuff in that Yankees series. Like I said, we'll dive into it in a little bit, but I'll just kind of leave it there for now. A quick recap of the Royals series. So game 1, also not going well for the Brewers, losing that one 11-1. Elvin Rodriguez made his Brewers debut, getting a start in that one. Things were, as we'll talk about a little later, I actually think quite a bit better than the final line score looked, but we'll dive into his performance and we'll kind of talk about what we liked from it, what we didn't like from it, what we think he can do moving forward. But really, this game got away when Elvis Peguero and then Grant Anderson were asked to eat up some innings on the back end of this one with the Brewers trailing. Elvis Peguero had a solid first inning, not so great in the second inning. Grant Anderson came in and couldn't throw any strikes, and it really just went off the rails from there. A couple of rough defensive plays as well that we're not really going to recap because I don't think anybody really wants to go back over that. The Brewers, however, able to bounce back in the next 2 games, winning game 2 of the series 5-0 for their first series win of the year. Chad Patrick going 4+. Couldn't quite finish 5 innings in his first MLB start, but did not allow a run. So good stuff from him there. Eric Haas, who got the start behind the plate to catch Chad Patrick, hit his first home run of the season in his first start of the season to really kick off the scoring and jumpstart things for the Brewers. Another standout from this game, Abner Uribe, making his first big league appearance in a regular season game since last May. So almost a year for him. He inherited a 2-on, 2-out jam and was able to get out of it pretty quickly. So good stuff for him. We'll talk about him as we get a little bit further on into the show as well. And then game 3, this one was even closer. A pitcher's duel between Freddie Peralta and
Cole Reagans.
Cole Reagans. I was at the game. How do I not remember his name? But a pitcher's duel between a couple of high stuff arms. Freddie Peralta delivering his longest start since 2019, going 8 innings, only allowing 1 run, only allowing 2 hits, actually. And I believe he finished with like 19 in a row retired at the time that he came out of the ball game. So really good stuff from Freddie. Just to have a really quick aside here, I think we've talked about how we've definitely been pretty hard on Freddie Peralta on this show over the last year plus. But a lot of that, like we always say, comes back to we know what he's capable of. And there's been a pretty big gap between what he's actually given the Brewers, as valuable as it has been.
Yes.
Most pitchers, you would absolutely take what he's given you over the last couple of years, especially in terms of the availability, being able to make all of his scheduled starts. That is a big deal. It has been extremely valuable to the Brewers, but still felt like he was leaving a lot on the table with what he's capable of doing. And this is kind of the Freddie Peralta that I think both of us have been waiting to see for quite some time. That doesn't mean he needs to go 8 innings, 1 run every time out, but more so the process-based stuff that allowed him to do that in this start. These are the kind of things that we've been waiting for pretty consistently. We'll talk about it later, but pitch mix, pitch selection, the way he went after guys, the fact that he was in the strike zone. He didn't walk anybody in this start, which was a big deal. And just keeping the pitch count in a good spot, too. Kind of just had everything working. He was able to complete those 8 innings on 97 pitches. So extremely efficient outing for him. Again, not saying he needs to do this every time, but this is the version of Freddie Peralta that I would like to see more often than not, because I think we can both agree that he's capable of this. And when we talk about a guy filling that number 1 role in a starting rotation for a contending team, these are the kind of ace-like performances you expect from somebody in that number 1 rotation spot from a team that not only is trying to win the division every year, but also is alleging to have World Series aspirations. These are the kind of starts you need sometimes. The bullpen is gassed. You're the number 1 guy. You just need to have these days where you're able to step up and do exactly what he did here in this start.
Yeah, 100%. Like you said, this is more in line with not necessarily the results that we know he's capable of, because we know he's capable of a very good start. This is a fantastic start. We're not expecting 8 innings, 1 earned, like you said. But I do think this is, like you said, we're going to talk about it more in depth in a minute, but just the way he attacked guys, the way he was in the zone consistently, he was mixing all of his pitches, and he was in the zone in competitive spots too. These weren't in zone, leaving stuff over the middle. This was in zone, hitting his spots within the zone, good command, good control, all of the stuff. He's going to have bouts with command. That is part of Freddie Peralta. He's got a bit of a, there's a lot of moving parts in the delivery. He's got stuff that can sometimes lose the command of it once in a while, but seeing glimpses of this, and I would point back to the first start too. I thought he pitched very well in the first start. It wasn't as good looking on the line score, and it wasn't as good of a start either, but I thought these are 2 really, really solid starts from Freddie, this one being great to start the season. And more than anything, it shows what he is capable of. And we're hoping, and the Brewers are going to need more of a true number 1 type of performance from him this year than they got last year. Right? We already talked about the injuries. There's going to be injuries all season. And while he's always brought the value of being able to be on the field, they do need more than that from him this year. And I think so far in the first 2 games, it looks like he's put himself in a good spot to do that more often this year.
Definitely something to watch as the year goes on, because it really would be a huge boost to the Brewers if he's kind of figured something out here and is finally in that position to take that next jump and be a little bit more consistent. Jackson Churio coming out of his slow start to the year with a 3-for-5 performance in this game. He hit a home run to open the scoring for the Brewers, and he would double later in the game as well. But for the most part, this was, like I said, a pitcher's duel. Ended up going to extra innings in this game. The Brewers stranding a lot of guys on base late in the game, some missed opportunities, especially in the 10th inning. But Bryce Terang was able to walk it off with a squeeze bunt in the bottom of the 11th. Pat Murphy actually came out to Terang and talked to him really briefly. So to set the stage here, in case any of you didn't have a chance to watch today, basically the Royals called a mound visit to just go over some stuff with Terang coming up. Terang was set to face another lefty again. The Pat Murphy started him in the leadoff spot against the left-handed starter today in Cole Reagans, and then Kansas City also has quite a few lefties down in that bullpen. I believe they threw 3 in relief today. So the Brewers actually faced 4 lefties on that Kansas City staff, and they were able to line him up against Bryce Terang. Bryce Terang is not a good hitter to begin with, and he's an even worse hitter against left-handed pitching, so we can have the discussion about why was he leading off against a lefty, but we're going to table that one for now because he did come through on the tail end here. But basically, the way that this was all setting up, you had the guy on third. Guy started on second as are we calling it the zombie runner? Is that the agreed upon
That
terminology for
or
that
the
guy?
Manfred runner.
The Manfred man. But starting on second base and moving over to third on a ground out by Garrett Mitchell, Joey Ortiz, and drawing a walk. And that set things up for Bryce Terang. Royals call a mound visit. Pat Murphy comes out to talk to Bryce Terang. At this point, everybody in the stadium, I think, knew what was coming. Bryce Terang was going to try to bunt here. Not a good matchup for him whatsoever. You had that guy on third base. Bryce is up there on the list of guys who can lay down a very clean bunt on this team. So I think everybody knew what was coming. And then you see Pat Murphy walk out there, and you're kind of thinking, okay, like I think everyone kind of knows what's about to happen here. And sure enough, the first pitch he squares around, drops a really, really nice bunt down the first baseline. And basically, Pat Murphy told us in postgame that that's what that conversation was. He said he went out to Bryce. He said, look, this is what we want to do here. Number one, are you comfortable doing this? Bryce said he was because he's done this before. And then Murphy said, all right, go do it. By the way, that first pitch you're going to get is probably going to be a breaking ball. So Bryce is ready. Drop that bunt down the first baseline. And like Murphy said post game, that was such a good bunt that you really can't defend that. I
No.
mean, the Royals are almost certainly expecting the bunt, but there's a limit to how far in you can play in that situation. So I believe they had the corners in for sure. But you can't have everybody creeping into the point where, you're like 40 feet away from the plate. That's not a good strategy either. But so basically, even with them prepared to defend the bunt, he put it in such a perfect spot where, with the pressure you're putting on the pitcher to make that kind of play, and then the speed you have going up the line, it was just going to be an extremely tough play to make. They couldn't make the play. Milwaukee walks it off. A small ball win for the Pat Murphy Brewers. Stop me if you've heard that one before. But Milwaukee not able to get a lot going offensively, but they were able to squeak out with a win here. And before we kind of dive into some deeper analysis stuff, unless you have your own thoughts on the bunt, do you have a soliloquy to the bunt that you'd like to offer up here?
Well, there was actually one piece of that play that was very interesting to me, and it really not something. It's actually I only noticed it because somebody asked, "Why did he throw to first base on it?" Because the
Yes.
pitcher picked it up and chucked to first. And I was trying to come up with a reason, and I don't think this is the reason he did it. But last time we were on here, I talked about how I always prided myself in trying to find not ways to break the rules, but ways to use the rules to my advantage and things like that. And just any little small thing I could find to try and, take advantage of in a baseball game. And the thing I thought of on that is that say Terang had been running outside of the runner's lane there. If the pitcher picked that up and hit him in the back with it, Terang would have been out and they would have returned all the runners to their base. And so I actually started thinking, I was like, if you have a squeeze play in a situation like that, where normally you wouldn't even think about throwing to first base, that actually might be the one way where like you have no shot at a play at home. That might be the one way you could possibly save the game by being smart enough to just pick it up and chuck it at his back and see if he's out of the runner's lane. So, like, I don't think that's what he was doing. But I had never thought of it. And I was like, that might be a way out of a weird squeeze play that you normally wouldn't be able to defend. And I actually went back and looked, and Bryce was smart enough. He like immediately, he obviously you start running inside the foul line, but he very quickly veered into the runner's lane so that there couldn't be anything like that. So I don't know if that had been discussed or if he just did that on his own, because normally hitters just don't do that. And that's why it gets called on him. But yeah, that was how my mind was working on that play after somebody asked, like, why would he throw it? And I was like, well, I guess there could technically be a reason why he threw it, and maybe a way he could have gotten out of it by doing that. So, but yeah, that was the interesting part of the play for me. Otherwise, yeah, it was just a perfect bunt. They had nothing they could actually do to get out at home on the play. And yeah, I think everybody in the park knew a bunt was coming, but it wasn't going to be a suicide squeeze. So it wasn't like they could just pitch out and avoid it, or he would just take it and they would end up having to walk him or whatever. So yeah, if he got it down in the right place, the Brewers were going to win, and he could not have placed it any better.
One final note from this game that I don't have in the agenda here that I just realized we should probably call out as well. Trevor McGill looked really, really good in his inning.
Yeah.
That might be as well as I've seen him, for as solid as he's been now for the last 2 seasons already. Even within that span, that might be about as well as I've seen him throw the baseball possibly ever. I mean, he felt good about the curveball to the point that he actually had a few sequences where he worked backward. But then you also had the at-bat that I kind of come back to, too, and the pitch that I come back to is against Bobby Witt. McGill gets the 2 strikes on him, leaves a fastball down, a little bit inner third, and Witt's late on it. He's able to follow it back, but you can tell he's late on it. Very next pitch. Perfect spot. Like, this is exactly where I was hoping the next one was going to be. Dotted that corner up and away with an upper 90s fastball, and he had no chance at it. So just really good stuff there. And that was one of those innings that positioned the Brewers to be in a spot where they were able to end up walking this one off in extra innings. But just looking at this series in general, I'm usually not a person to say that this was such a huge game for the Brewers this quickly into the season. But the way that they started things out here was not a normal slow start. So after that Yankees series, there was still really no actual concern on my concern meter, so to speak. It was one series against a really good team, a team that basically did the exact same thing to them the last time they faced them a year ago, too. I think the Brewers and the Yankees, the Brewers pitching staff, the Yankees are a bad matchup for any pitching staff, but I think they're an especially bad matchup for the Brewers pitching staff. And we'll kind of get into this in a little bit here as well. Just the way they like to put their game plans together, the kind of stuff that they're going to throw at you. It's just the Yankees hit everything, but they especially hit, the mix of upper 80s to low 90s fastballs, and we saw that a lot in that series. That series really did not raise any concern for me. But then to see them come home for the home opener and have essentially the exact same showing against a different team, a lineup that is not the Yankees lineup, to get trounced again and get boat raced by 10 runs for another game yet. I guess they didn't get trounced by 10 in game 3. That was a 9-run deficit, but we're basically talking about the same thing here. As soon as that happened, my concern meter probably went up to like a 6 out of 10. Or 5 out of 10 maybe, like to the point of not where they were in trouble yet, but to me, they were one more bad loss away from being in a spot mentally where it's like, even if you are way better than this, it's going to get very, very tricky, and the odds are not going to be in your favor for snapping out of it. So the Brewers in those first 4 games of the regular season, they set multiple dubious records. They set a record for the most they set a record for the most home runs allowed in their first 4 games of the season. I believe they tied the record for the most runs allowed in the first 4 games of the season, and then they set a record for the worst run differential of any team in its first 4 games of the regular season. Like, this is not there are slow starts. That happens to everybody. And when it happens at the beginning of the year versus the middle of the season, there's always going to be way more attention placed on it. It's
Yep.
going to be under the microscope when people might not notice it that much if it happens in July or the dog days of August. But a negative, I believe, what was it, 35 run differential or something like that? I might have the number wrong. It was at least 32 though. Maybe it was 32. I think the previous was negative 31 and the Brewers are at negative 32
Yeah,
in
it'd be
those first 4
32.
games. I should know this because I put it in the story I wrote about it, but I don't have it in front of me. But the bottom line is when you're setting that kind of record, that tells you that these are not normal. This is not a normal losing streak. Generally speaking, good teams do not have a stretch like this ever in their season. Fortunately, the precedent that you were going up against was the team that actually had that previous record ended up going like 90 and 72, I think, that year. So they did end up coming back, but otherwise the track records for those other teams in that kind of territory was not pretty, both in terms of getting back over 500 and making the playoffs. So the Brewers were entering oh crap territory. Like if you have, these guys can say whatever they want, but I think if you go into that second game against the Royals and you have 1 or 2 more losses like that all within this short period of time to start the season, I do believe there is a line mentally where it's just that gets so heavy that it's just hard to snap out of, even if you are way more talented than that. So I do think the Brewers avoided potential disaster here by coming back and winning these next 2 games. I think that was really important for them just to see that they can still win baseball games and that what happened those first 4 games is not a new normal. This was a weird start to the year. I'll put it that way. But like I said, I'm usually not one to make those bolder statements like the Brewers needed to win these next 2 games or else they were cooked. But this was an unprecedented, horrific start to the season for the Brewers. So for them to stop the bleeding there and to roll off a couple of wins after that, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that those 2 wins could end up being a difference maker in what direction their season takes from here. I think if they had 2 more really bad 1 or 2 more blowout losses again after those first 4 games, like, they would have been staring down a pretty scary path, I think, for the rest of their season.
Yeah, I mean, even just, and I don't like playing body language police or anything like that, but during that Yankees series, I mean, some of them look pretty shell shocked leaving the mound or even just in the dugout, kind of watching it happen over and over. And if that happened again in this series, and like you said, at least one more time, at some point it gets to the point where it's like, are we really able to are we capable? Like, are we even good enough to do what we think we were capable of doing heading into the season? And it gets to a point where just mentally it would have been a tough hill to climb if you get that far. So I agree with you. I think those are probably the 2 biggest wins I've ever seen the Brewers have in their first 6 games of the season. Like, I would have never, most years I'm just not gonna care about the record after a week. And if they went 2-4 and they had lost if they went 1-5 and all 5 losses were like 1-2 run losses, it'd be like, all right, they're playing fine, or even one really bad one, and whatever. The majority of the games are competitive, but 3 already very uncompetitive losses, and then you would have mixed in another one. Even close losses would have been tough if you took those in these next 2. Just burying yourself down 0-6 or 1-5 with 3+ really bad losses. It would have been a tough hill to climb mentally. And you already have all the noise about, oh, they lost, Willie Adames, it's clubhouse leader. Like, is there energy there? I mean, Uke is gone. He was a guy who brought a lot of clubhouse energy. So there were already narratives kind of forming. Like, can these guys even do this without their leaders and their energy guys is mostly how they were referred to when people were talking about it. And at some point, as a player, the noise no longer becomes noise, and it's just like what you think too. Now it's in your head, and you start thinking those things too. Like, is that really what's happening? So, this was big. These were two big wins. I don't care how ugly game 3 was, despite the fact that they absolutely should have won it at least an inning earlier. Bases loaded, nobody out, and can't scratch across the winning run. Like, that was honestly, it would have been pretty tough to bounce back after a loss like that. After that, too, like, you had your chance in the 10th, and then they go ahead and win it in the 11th. That would have been a really tough one to swallow, too. So, being able to pull it out and end up with the win, really, really big, probably mentally, but also just for the players mentally, but also I think for the fan base, people needed this too. So hopefully this will kickstart some more winning ways as we head into the next few series. But yeah, it would have been tough if they wouldn't have pulled these ones out.
Definitely a whirlwind of a first week's worth of games, because you went from,
Yeah,
okay, opening day loss, it's not a bad loss, it's going to be fine. Blown out in game 2, it's just one game, it looks worse because it's early, they'll be okay. Blown out in game 3, okay, they obviously are not playing good baseball or competitive baseball against this one team. Let's see what happens when they get home. Blown out by that team in the same way, and now at that point, you're pushed up to the line of things are about to fall apart. In my mind, at least. Like I said, I think
yeah.
I seriously think you're another loss or two like that away from even, and this is not a knock on the players, like, I think that is going to test
Oh yeah,
even the strongest mentality guys in that clubhouse. And they can say all the right things to the media, but I have a hard time believing that, if you have one more, two more losses like that is going to shake you to your core. Just seeing it happen so improbably over and over and over and over again this early, like that is going to test you. And in my mind, with all the challenges that last year's Pat Murphy's Brewers face and the way that they answered the bell almost every single time, I think already this early, this is a far graver challenge than any they already faced last year. So it was going to be really big to see how they responded to that, and they were able to bounce back with a couple more wins. And I usually try to never be overly dramatic about this stuff, but those are potentially season-saving wins right there already
yeah,
within the first week of the year. So good that the Brewers ended up in the win column in those two, because if they had lost both of them, especially if they had lost one or both of them by another blowout score, we would probably be having a pretty grave conversation right now. But fortunately, we don't have to do that. So hopefully, the good times keep rolling here. At this point, I'm much more back to a state of they're probably going to be okay. I don't think there's
yeah.
a whole lot to worry about here. But we'll dive into some more specifics here from what we've seen just generally from the Brewers. Obviously, the pitching is going to be the big story here, because just shelled in those first 4 games, and then really good performances in the last 2, a lot more like what we've come to expect from this Brewers pitching staff. And those first 4 games surprised me, because I still saw and I do still see the strength of this team being the pitching. For me, the question mark, and we kind of talked about this over the offseason, the question mark is going to be on the offensive side. Do they have enough power to the point that they're a reliable offense? I think they're still going to be, even if they don't hit for power, I think they would still be close to average, because they get on base so much, and they have those other ways to make things happen at least sometimes. But you need the power, and I think that's what'll be the difference between them. If they get the power they need, especially from guys taking steps forward like we've talked about, probably
Hmm.
looking at, again, a top 10 offense in baseball. But, if they don't get that, there's the very real path in which they end up being one of the least powerful teams in baseball. I'm not saying like a bottom 3 offense or anything, but one of the least powerful teams, and very limited in the ways that they can make things happen. So that's a conversation for another time. We'll talk about the pitching now. The the thing that I just keep coming back to so far, and this is, it's tough to say anything definitive about this because it is such a small sample, but this is something we talked about a lot last year. Just the Brewers having that emphasis on calling and mixing different fastball variations. They like to have the sinker, they really like the sinker cutter combination, and then they
Mhm.
like to work some four seamers in there as well, especially if you're someone who throws all three. That's generally the way that they'll kind of line that up, like sinker, cutter, and then we'll mix some four seamers in too. That first series against the Yankees, I just keep coming back to. They threw ton a ton of fastballs to a team that just kept destroying fastballs, and there was really no evidence of any adjustment throughout that entire series. Uh, Now, some of that is a product of the guys you had on the mound. I will say, like Nestor Cortez, for example. I saw quite a few people just berating him for leaving pitches over the plate that the Yankees were ambushing at the top of the zone. But the reality is, like, mixing four seamers and cutters at the top of the zone is how Nestor Cortez has gotten outs in the big leagues for the majority of his career. So I don't really blame him for trying to stick to that through those first couple innings, at least against the Yankees. Like, that is going to be your starting point. You're going to try to find the way to get guys out with your best stuff. And in Nestor Cortez's defense, he's only got one breaking ball. He's got that sweeper, but he doesn't really have anything else. They're working on the changeup, but he's never thrown that a lot. He's never really thrown the sweeper a ton either. So, asking a guy to throw his normal game plan out the window like that, while I think there was more room for adjustment than what we saw, that is a tough ask too, to ask someone to, if you were to ask him in the middle of that game, hey, we just got to throw a ton of sweepers now. He's not used to doing that. It's not always that simple. But what I keep coming back to is the last two games of that Yankees series when you had Nestor Cortez starting and then Aaron Savali starting. 50.6% of the pitches the Brewers threw in those last two games were fastballs between 85 and 93 miles an hour. The hitters in that Yankees lineup last year, they slugged 424 or 524, excuse me, against those pitches. The Yankees hit everything. So I'm not convinced that switching up the game calling, it was for sure something that would have worked. But you were clearly playing into one of their best strengths and just no evidence of changing that outside of what Freddie Peralta did. Freddie Peralta was the
Yep.
one who actually switched things up in game one, and he settled down because he started throwing a lot more changeups, and that got them off the fastball more. And then you bring in Cortez for game two. He starts going at them with his usual plan of attack, which I think is the right call. They're all over it. And then as that game went on, too, that's when the walks started coming in for him. I don't think he was very sharp command wise to begin with, so that probably doesn't help. But Bill Schroeder kept talking about in that game about how it looked like he was nibbling for the rest of that start, almost in response to those early swings. Well, at that point, again, like, I understand you can't stray too far from what he's done for his entire career, and you can't necessarily ask him to try something entirely new on the fly in a game. But at the same time, like, more of the adjustment needs to be, at least let's mix a little more breaking stuff in as opposed to trying to nibble with the same pitches, and then you're in an even worse spot.
Yeah, that's the thing with a guy like him, and we'll talk about Savali in a minute here, but with a guy like Cortez, you're right. It's not like you can just completely reinvent what he does on the fly in the middle of a game. But mixing in some of the off speed, even some more changeups, but probably more of the sweeper, doing that's the type of stuff that helps you get back to your fastball approach, is to help you, like, okay, now they have to really be concerned about the sweeper and the changeup. And now I can get back to, okay, now I'm going to go at you with your fastball a little bit more often. Like, there's a game to be played there where you can use the off speed to actually allow you to get back to that fastball heavy approach by getting hitters to actually have to, it keeps them honest is really what it's doing. And it's also in the process probably going to get you some outs by changing speeds and doing everything else. But if the plan is to still be fastball heavy, that's fine. But you have to show them other stuff, or it just becomes too easy for them to sit on whatever they're looking for every single time. So um it was it was frustrating. That one was less frustrating for me in terms of pitch calling and more just, I mean, Cortez's velo was down. He was not locating. 5 walks and 5 homers in 2 innings it is quite the accomplishment. So he certainly did not have things going for himself in that one, and that happened. That game, honestly, like it felt like it didn't really matter what the Brewers did at times. The wind was blowing out. The Yankees were hitting some moonshots and then also sneaking some cheap Yankee Stadium homers in there as well. And it was just like it didn't matter what we're doing right now. They're finding a way to just poke them out, or everything was kind of going their way on offense. And sometimes that happens. Like we've said a bunch of times, the Yankees are a very, very good offense. Like the Brewers pitching was not good. I think we don't believe the pitch calling or the sequencing was great either. But the Yankees also just did not miss mistakes. And I feel like sometimes people don't realize how often mistakes get missed in MLB. Like bad pitches, pitchers get away with them, not at the level they would in like college or high school, but you still get away with them. Somebody's going to hit a 110-mile-per-hour line drive right to the center fielder on one. Somebody's going to overswing and pop one up. Like they get away with them. The Brewers were not getting away with them on that day. Like it didn't matter. Like if you made a mistake, the Yankees just crushed it. And sometimes that happens. And to me, that game was, yes, a terrible start from Cortez and Connor Thomas. Things didn't go much better. In Thomas's, not defense, but he is very similar to Cortez in the way he pitches in terms of velo and movement. And the way they deployed him was very similar to what they had just seen with Cortez. So it wasn't much of a difference for the hitters. They eventually went to a little more sweeper and change up with Thomas than they did with Cortez, but that didn't work great either. So either way, it was not going well for him. That game too, for me, that one, if you take out the next two games, I would just be like, you know what? That's baseball, man. It happens. The Yankees got crazy hot on a hot weather day with the wind blowing out. Guys weren't executing great. I can live with that type of game. It sucks. It's not fun to watch in the moment, obviously. Yankees were setting major league records like nobody's business. They set their own franchise record for homers in a game, which when the Yankees set a franchise record, that's pretty impressive since they have been around for a very, very long time. And not only that, they've had lineups with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and all these types of things too. So when they're setting homer records, things were obviously very much in their favor that day. And for me, that game too, on its own, I could have easily just, flushed it and said, you know what, great game from them. Brewers didn't have it today. I think it was that game 3 that really, really started to bother me. So, yeah, I mean, you can take it wherever you want there, but that was really the one that was tougher for me to watch.
Yeah, game 3 was a little more frustrating because you had Aaron Savali going in that one. You are now 2 games into watching the New York Yankees destroy fastballs that don't have great velocity. Aaron Savali, 3 different kinds of breaking pitches last year. He had the sweeper, he had the big curve, he had the shorter slider, he had down the stretch, or directed down the stretch, which he had previously before, with the Rays had scrapped the Brewers back. Instead, Aaron Savali went out there and threw, what was it, almost 70% fastballs in his start.
I think it was 76%, if I recall.
Over 70, yeah, I think it was closer to 80. That was frustrating because at that point, you have a guy who is fully capable of doing something a little bit differently and make that switch, and still didn't do it. Now, that does kind of open the can of worms of when do the Brewers believe is the right time to make that adjustment? Because there is a lot of work that goes into the game planning. So they obviously felt very good about going in there and attacking the Yankees the way that they tried to. What's the barometer then of needing to switch things up? Maybe for them that they just didn't get to that point yet. I would argue that after you see those swings, those first 2 games, you got to try something different. They didn't. I guess the other wrinkle in here as well is that Aaron Savali would leave that game with the hamstring issue.
Yeah.
And so it's his left hamstring, so that would be his plant leg. I don't know if that was impacting his ability to finish certain pitches. That's always to think about as well. At the same time, if he was good enough to still be on the mound, I think they're more trying a little bit than what they did. and that's keep coming back to here. So I don't think we need to see 76% cutters, thinkers from Savali. I think we could have seen a little more breaking stuff, especially in that first inning, too. In the first inning, I believe they only threw like 2 breaking balls in the entire first inning, and it was like almost a 30 pitch inning.
Yeah, I know through the Aaron Judge homer, he had gone 1 of 19. So the 19th pitch was the Judge homer, and he had only thrown 1 breaking ball. So I believe the next pitch was a fastball, and then he might have thrown another one, but I think it ended up being 2 or 3 breaking balls on the inning. Yeah.
So there's that one for me, and we'll talk about Elvin Rodriguez in a little bit. We'll go more detail on him after we cover some other points here. But then in game 4, Elvin Rodriguez getting the first start, another guy who throws 2 different breaking pitches. And I still believe his sweeping slider is his best pitch. I don't think it's particularly close either. Went out in his first start, 84% of his pitches were a fastball variant. And we'll dive into the specifics of the arsenal a little bit, but this is kind of just to make the broader point. Man, that's a lot of fastballs.
Yeah.
And look, the Brewers, this is not new for them to call a lot of fastballs. This is what they would do with guys like Colin Ray and Bryce Wilson. But Colin Ray and Bryce Wilson also just the breaking stuff was not great for them. I know Colin Ray had the sweeper that actually served him pretty well when he did break it out, but for him and Wilson, like there was a clearer path to, throwing a lot of fastballs and just mixing those 3 fastballs is probably the best way to go for you, and it made sense. But now it almost feels like they're calling too many pitchers as if they're Colin Ray or Bryce Wilson when Colin Ray and Bryce Wilson are not on the team anymore. And, we've talked about William Contreras a lot because he's behind the plate a lot. There were a couple of games last year where we noticed, like, sequences, especially if you talk about William catching versus, say, Eric Haas catching, where William was going more heavy fastball when he was back there. And to tie it back to Savali too, that Savali start in Oakland from last year is still one that I come back to where it was just a ton of fastballs and it was not working. And that's not how a guy whose whole ability is the fact that he can spin the baseball in just about any way you need him to, and to just be putting down fastballs the entire game. That just seems like a waste to me, a waste of his other abilities. However, when you look at what was going on through these first 2 games, I have a hard time believing it's just a William Contreras thing. We'll keep talking about it as we go along here, but this is a good time to work in a question we got from HC Purdy. Kind of relates to what I just talked about. Does William Contreras' style of calling a game tend to work well with some pitchers and not well with others? I'm confused with his tendency to call a very high proportion of fastballs. So I'll give you a chance to comment too, but I think we can kind of just go back to what we've said before. You would hear, like Colin Ray in particular, talk very highly of just the rhythm he would have with Contreras. I think there very much is something to this. We've said this before. I think the style of game that he got into the habit of calling, it definitely helped when you had someone like Ray or Bryce Wilson, like those kinds of guys eating a lot of innings for the Brewers.
Mm-hmm.
I think you run into problems then, like I said, when you have another pitcher on the mound who's not Colin Ray, but William Contreras is trying to call a very similar kind of game when it's a different pitcher with different strengths who has better breaking stuff as a starter. Out of the bullpen, at least, like we've seen, like Piamps and Peguero so far have still thrown quite a few breaking balls, but there were even some sequences in the past. Like I know last year you were miffed by when they were in Minnesota and Contreras went back to a front door 2-seamer from Jacob Junis to Carlos Santana when he was very clearly right on it instead of going to the slider. And Junis has a very good slider.
Mm-hmm.
So just, things like that. This is not me putting on my reporter hat because I've never, heard from anyone who has said this, but that just remains like my educated guess here that he got into a habit of calling these guys in this way and it worked well and like good feedback on that to the point where it just does seem like sometimes he calls a lot of these other guys that same way even if that's not always the best way to go about it.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even really add much to that. It's you brought up the examples I was going to bring up even, so that's pretty impressive on your part. That Oakland
Good
game
call.
really, the Oakland game was just it bothered me a lot last year at that point. And then being in person for that Twins game, anytime you're at a game, I think there's always a little bit more like fandom instead of reality, or I don't know how else to word it, but you let the emotions play a little bit more because you're at the game. You spent time to go there. You spent time and money to go there and all these different things. So I've always noticed that too. Like people who are at the game tend to be a little bit more on edge than people watching on TV. And that's just common, it's human nature kind of. But yeah, I mean, I was extremely upset about that Jacob Junis pitch. And probably about as mad as I've ever showed to be at just a random regular season game, because it was exactly what I had been worried about with William. And I do think it's exactly what HC Purdy is asking and what you just talked about. I think it is that he got really good feedback, both from the pitchers themselves, like Ray and Wilson, and even Tobias Myers. It was a very good approach for him to go fastball cutter a ton of the time. And it kind of became like, oh, well, this is how we call a game now. Like, this is what we're going to do. And he got so into the rhythm of doing that it's just like, yeah, throw down a finger. Sometimes you spin it for well, I guess he doesn't even throw down a finger, touch the button on the side of your leg, and go from there. But yeah, I think he's just gotten into a rhythm. And I will say, on the Savali note, Savali does wear the pitch com that he can call pitches with as well. And I did notice that he was calling some of the pitches and some of the pitches that I didn't agree with as well. So I'm not going to say this was completely Contreras. I do think Savali might even be in a mode where he's getting where he wants to be more fastball heavy than he should be, which is that's maybe not a great combo either. But and I should also even point out he did shake to whatever pitch Judge hit out in the first inning too. He shook whatever William had first put down, or not again put down, I keep saying, but whatever he had pressed on the controller on his leg there. And so it is not just a William Contreras thing, but I do think, and with, we saw it last year, that there was a difference when Haas was calling pitches versus Contreras in terms of fastball usage. Like, it was a quantifiable, noticeable difference. And to me, that means it's not just the Brewers' plan of attack, that there is an element of Contreras also kind of just falls into a pattern with this a little bit more than Haas does. And there's a comfortability for him doing that. But I think it's important for him to kick that comfortability and get to a point where he's mixing. In this Freddie start in game 3 is a fantastic example of what it can look like when he does go outside of maybe his norms, because that was an incredible. I mean, the first inning was all fastballs, and after that, the mix was unbelievably good. Like, it was, hitters were off balance. Nobody knew what was coming. I'll be honest, most of the time, Jack, I think you and I are similar here. We can almost sit there and say what Williams going to call on this next pitch quite often. Like, a lot of times he does get predictable. There was no chance today. I mean, he was fantastic. I'm sure Freddie played a part in that too, but like, if he can get into that type of mode more often, and of course it helps that Freddie was commanding and executing all of these pitches with quite a bit of consistency. Like, that makes it easier for a catcher to go back to each pitch feeling good about, okay, yeah, he's landing this wherever I need it to be. That makes it easier. But at the same time, I watched him in the Yankee series have fastballs end up middle all the time, and he kept going back to it. So it's not like he needed to see, like, there was plenty of proof that they weren't commanding that either. So, yeah, I think that's probably the thing, is like, we now have a really good example that hopefully he can point to himself and say, okay, for certain guys, like, this is how I need to do it. And yeah, hopefully it's not just a jumping off point for Freddie's season, but hopefully this is something that, William can really take something from and carry over too.
Yeah, I mean, and this is always a really tough topic to talk about. So I never try to speak with 100% certainty on this, because again, we can't really quantify pitch calling. But when we're talking about it if there are numbers you're trying to look at, it's not always just pitch usage. It's also when you're throwing those pitches, the
Mhm.
sequencing, the order of those pitches, and that's where. So William was near the top in baseball in terms of percentage of pitches thrown when he was behind the plate being some kind of fastball. I think that's partially William, but I also think a lot of that was the guys the Brewers
Mhm.
had eating a lot of innings for them last year. It's just like we said, it made sense. It made sense for quite a few of those guys. I think it makes sense for significantly fewer of those guys this year with the staff they have now. But it's not just the percentage of fastballs called; it's also how you're calling them, the sequencing, and that Matt Trueblood wrote about that last year as well. Contreras was. I don't know if you'd say this at the top or at the bottom, how you want to frame this, but he was the extreme among the extremes in if he called a secondary pitch, he was probably going to go right back to a fastball right after it, no matter what kind of swing or what kind of take or whatever he got. And I think that's where you really started to run into a lot of trouble is if you got a really bad swing on a breaking ball or you got a really bad take or like the guy just looked like he was not did not see it at all, especially compared to maybe a fastball he saw earlier in the at bat or in a previous at bat, and then you just go right back to the fastball. That's what irks me a little bit is when he would do stuff like that. So then to see him come out and just call a bunch of fastballs again in New York and then in game one of the Royals series, like that's what it gives you the flashbacks to. So it's very hard to, and again, in terms of things that I analyze and break down, I'm never going to put pitch calling at the top of that list because it is so there's just a lot that goes into it. And a lot of
Mhm.
times there's no clear cut right answer. There is a lot of opinion involved in this, but there is also an element of like you can figure out trends, what works and what doesn't. So there's that to think about as well. But if people want my honest opinion, just the way that I see it, I think Contreras again was the he got good at sequencing in a way that worked for Colin Ray, for Bryce Wilson, for Tobias Myers a lot, where it's, hey, you got three different kinds of fastballs that spin differently. Let's try to let's try to mix those, and then that'll kind of be how you play up a little bit. We'll get contact just off the barrel. Defenders are going to feel that we're going to be okay. It's not the same deal when you have more guys now who I think the Brewers have on this staff this year who have really good breaking balls. Now you can't call the same kind of game. That's not going to work anymore. It's not the same kind of arsenal. But it seems to me so far like he's doing a lot of the same things, and I don't think that is going to work. I don't think it's worked especially well so far. I think it's something that needs to change. I don't think it's just him. I think there's a lot of input that goes into this.
Mhm.
But again, when Eric Haas was back behind the plate, the sequences were different. And I've talked to Eric Haas just about game planning and things like that. Like you can tell that is a guy who very much gets how this works. And again, there's a lot of other things going on behind the scenes that we almost certainly don't know about. But if people want my honest opinion, I think a lot of what you hear about Contreras' game calling, I think he's quite a bit overrated on that front. I don't think it's nearly as good as a lot of the stuff we would hear from Murph or from certain pitchers last year. I don't think he's nearly that good at it. That's my opinion. I think Eric Haas is the best game caller the Brewers have. I think mechanically too, Haas has looked like a better receiver so far.
Mhm.
Will that continue to be the case? I don't know because we've seen William receive really well a couple of years ago. Took a step back this year. It's too early to have framing numbers so that those don't really mean anything. But just mechanically, I've seen him pull some pitches out of the strike zone, and then I've seen like when Haas caught for Patrick, I've seen him again get those calls at the top, hold pitches better. Just his body is a little more stable because of the way that he's adjusted his stance, like we've talked about. Things like that. I think Haas is the better game caller. I think right now he looks like the better all around defender, but it's a small sample. We have a lot of season left. William is going to have to catch a lot of games because
Yes.
guess what? He's one of the Brewers' best hitters either way. He should be in the lineup, and you need that DH spot for Christian Yelich a lot of days, or maybe Rhys Hoskins sometimes. Like this is how it's going to have to be. But right now, just my eye for this kind of stuff, and people can take it or leave it for what that's worth. My eye for this kind of stuff, I have been disappointed with how he's been behind the plate so far in this very small sample, so hopefully it turns around.
Yeah, I'm in the exact same boat. I do think I agree with you in terms of, I think when pitchers hit their spots, William receives the ball fine. It feels to me like when he has to move or shift a little bit, that's when he starts to struggle a little bit with it. And again, that's completely my eye, but it's it's been a bit of a tough watch so far. And I'm sure some of this is even carrying over from the at bats because the at bats have been pretty rough in this first couple two or these first couple series as well. But um yeah, it's been a bad start for William, I think pretty much on every level, and it's also been 6 games. So, we're taking some of the pitch calling stuff and everything else, and we're also attributing that from last year. This is last year and the first 6 games. I'm not worried about the bat at all. I think the receiving last year improved as the season progressed a little bit, and
It
I
did.
will also say I do think receiving is a little more difficult the fewer amount of times you have caught people, and he is catching a lot of arms that he has not caught. So you can know all the metrics, you can know how your stuff works, but sometimes a pitch moves a little later than you would expect, and that makes it more difficult to really work around and catch it. And like if you don't know the pitcher that well, I will say that can be a little bit more difficult. That's part of the reason I think they wanted Haas to catch Patrick. He had been catching him in Nashville last year. So familiarity probably does help a little bit too with some of the receiving stuff, and that may help him as he gets used to some of these arms. But yeah, I again, it feels like we probably are viewed as the podcast that just kind of rips on William a lot of times. And like William Contreras is an awesome baseball player. He's very, very good, and he is a great hitter. But we also are pretty generally going to call out things that we genuinely believe. And I think this is something we're pretty steady in our belief in it that there needs to be some improvement in the pitch calling, and that um, it's not just him. It is some organizational stuff, and there is some relation to the pitchers that he's caught. But I do think the one you brought up, the fact that, and this is off the top of my head, but I believe that in that True Blood article, it was 70% of the time or higher that he had gone back to a fastball after the breaking ball or off speed. And that one was pretty insane. I remember seeing that graph, and there wasn't anyone all that close to him on that graph. And that's the type of stuff that it's like, okay, that's just too predictable, and you're not helping the pitchers. The pitchers can locate, and even like you said, I think the Cortez homers, some of it, and that's Cortez. Cortez is going to kind of call his own game too. I should note. I think most of the time, he's kind of gotten used to that. Not necessarily with the pitch comp, but he is this is how I pitch, and he knows how he does well, and normally it works. But some of those pitches were like exactly where the target was, or even missing a bit further, to the ball side of things, like off the plate, out of the zone, and still getting turned on and hit. And to me, that's when hitters are just locking in on certain things because you're getting predictable. So, yeah, this isn't meant to be like, oh, we think Williams terrible, but it is a fault of his, I think, in our opinion. And like I said earlier, I really hope that this Freddie start was kind of a jumping off point for him to maybe have it click a little bit. Like, hey, this is a guy whose nickname is Fastball Freddie, and we went with a very diverse mix here, and it worked extremely well for him. So hopefully, this is something that we can just kind of carry through.
I mean, really, all that what pitching is yes, you have to attack guys, but really to get guys out, it's you got to find some way to either subvert expectations or
Yep.
really just find ways to prevent guys from locking in on a location, on a shape, on something. There are some guys who can throw the same pitch over and over and over again. Remember Josh Hader a few years ago. Guys could still not lock in on that because the shape and the look and everything was just so weird. So that's your way of subverting the expectation and making it something guys can't lock in on. The vast majority of the time, it's going to be kind of, what you hear. You got to mix speeds, you got to mix locations, like do these certain kinds of things. You really just need to find that right blend of I need to get my velocity, my shapes, the way the ball behaves needs to be in the right spot, and the looks that I give hitters other ways needs to be in the right spot. So sequencing, location, like it's a different blend for each guy, but generally speaking, like there are some common factors that you need to be thinking about. And that's why for Freddie's actually a really good example of this because it used to be like we've talked
Mhm.
about, he could get the fastball by guys because they weren't used to seeing that. It was so weird. Like he could throw it 70% of the time and guys still couldn't figure it out. They still couldn't lock in on it. Now, Freddie's been around a while. The fastball shape isn't quite what it used to be. It's not as unique anymore. Guys can lock in on it more now if he's throwing it a lot. So now, in these last two starts, he's pivoted to a different way to keep guys from locking in on stuff. Now it's the mix is a little different. He's going to some different locations. The sequencing is different. And I do want to come back to that because, we've spent the last 10 minutes talking about just some of these ways in which we're nitpicking Williams' game calling. Again, I don't know how much of it was Freddie, how much of it was him in this start, so let's just look at them as a battery. After that first inning, like, that was exactly what we're talking about.
Mhm.
Guys couldn't it was not predictable. You had no way to really lock in on what pitch was coming next. I mean, after that first inning, under 50% of the pitches that he threw were fastballs. And from there, it was like a good mix of changeup, curveball, slider. Like there were some at bats where he would work backwards, some where he would not work backwards, some where he'd start guys with the breaking stuff and then go fastball, some where he'd start guys fastball, then go breaking ball. Like the sequencing was not predictable. And you saw it work exceptionally well. And even in New York, when it was more changeups, you saw it work exceptionally well. So I think like what Freddie did in this start, like those are the kind of things that I would like to see more pitchers who have the capability to do that doing when William is behind the plate and as the game caller, he needs to be contributing to that.
Yeah,
So on that
100%.
note, unless you have anything you want to add,
No.
on that note, we can kind of jump into Elvin Rodriguez's start because I said we were going to talk about that a little more. So again, 84% of the pitches he threw in that start to William Contreras were a fastball variant. Elvin Rodriguez basically has two fastballs. He experimented with a sinker a little bit overseas last year. I don't think we've really seen it over here. I haven't seen it yet, at least. Uh, Now the note here is he should be throwing quite a few four seam fastballs because that grades out as a very good fastball. It's super verty. It's got a little more velo. Like that is a pitch he should be throwing quite a bit. He threw it 48% of the time in his debut outing, and that I don't have a problem with. He averaged 20 inches of vert on it. He got 5 whiffs out of 20 swings. That's 25%. And again, I talked about how I actually thought he was quite a bit better than the line indicated.
Mhm.
There was some loud contact early. It was really those first 2 innings, but the next 2 innings, if you actually look at his location plot, I should have plopped it into the video version of the podcast here, but I didn't. Everything was like up. Like at the corners like up. He was not throwing anything over the heart of the plate those final 2 innings, and guys did not have good swings off him, and even in those first couple innings, he was getting some whiffs with that fastball still. It plays. It grades out well. Stuff models like it. My issue, and this is where I come back to, it feels like the Brewers are trying to just squeeze him into the same mold that they've used for other guys that might not work for him. 36% of his pitches were cutters. 4% of his pitches were that sweeping slider. 6% were the big curveball. It does seem also like when they want to go breaking ball, they want to go the big curveball more. I can kind of see that if you're trying to play off the high fastball. I just like the shape of that slider so much more, though. When he was overseas last year, there was at least one stuff model that gave his slider like a 169 stuff plus. Guys had like over a 40% whiff rate against it. I don't have the graphic in front of me, but it was like insane numbers. Those guys
Yeah.
could not touch his slider. And I was really expecting that when he came over here, we were going to see more of that. He was super fastball heavy in spring training. I didn't read much into it because it's like, okay, he's working on things. Hopefully, this isn't the mix that he's using when he gets to the regular season. He used the exact same mix in the first start. And again, it's not the four seamer I take issue with, it's the cutter. I don't like it. Just from what we can see on our end, I don't like it. The stuff models really aren't enamored with it. I think the shape is kind of inconsistent on it. It
Oh,
got hit pretty hard when he was in Japan last year when he did throw it. Like, it's just I don't think it's a great pitch, but it seems like the Brewers are doing this thing again where, well, it's worked for Colin Ray, it's worked for Bryce Wilson, it's worked for Tobias. So they're trying to do it here, like pair the cutter with the four seamer, and those are your fastball variants. And we're going to try to, help both of those pitches play up, even if the cutter doesn't necessarily grade out great. But I think in his case, man, I don't like the cutter, and I really, really like the breaking stuff. I like the sweeper. I think that's his best pitch. And at some point, like, if this doesn't work, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe it will work. I hope it does because this seems to be the plan. But at some point, man, like maybe we just got to drop this and be like, "Hey, this slider's really good. Let's just let it eat." Like let's allow your two pitches to play, and we can still use the cutter as an in-between pitch, but we don't need to throw it, almost 40% of the time. Like it
yeah.
can still be a bridge pitch. I understand keeping it, especially if he's going to start. If he's going to
Mhm.
start, I think he does still need it. I talked when they signed him about how there were kind of two ways they could go with this. If they were going to stretch him out, they did need to basically keep every pitch type in his arsenal. If they're going to pitch him out of the pen, then I think you could have scrapped the cutter and just gone with the two best pitches, the fastball and the sweeper, maybe mix some curves in. I think if he's going to start, he does need to keep all these pitches. And I do think he can start. This, I just don't know if this is the mix. I think there's room to throw fewer cutters, a lot more sweepers, and just make that work. Again, I could be wrong. I hope I am because this seems to be what they're going to try for quite a bit here. But like this is again another situation where I'm like, come on, man. It's 2025 and the approach is going to be let's just throw a lot of fastballs with this guy who we know can spin it. I don't know. Again, I like seeing I want to see quite a lot of four seamers, but then I want to see a lot of sweepers too. Like I just don't like seeing the cutter this much. I don't. Yes, there's something to be said for how pitches play off of each other because no pitch exists in isolation, but I'm not convinced that this is actually going to work as well as they seem to think it will.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. This was the day I was on Twitter complaining about the well, it started with Savali and then I followed up with the fact that Elvin was just not using the sweeper a couple of times. Th- There were some people who were like, well, sometimes it's a guy, he's making his first MLB start or at least his first one in quite a while. Um yeah, there might have been some nerves. It's the home opener. Is he able to even land the sweeper? Like, is he feeling comfortable with it? And thing is, he threw four of them, and three of them were in the zone. So he clearly had a fine feel for it, and they weren't in the zone like sitting over the middle. They were actually hitting pretty good spots to throw a sweeper too. So not only is it a pitch that should be able to get you some whiff outside of the zone, he was actually comfortable landing it the few times he did throw it in the game. I agree with you that if they're going to go to the breaking ball, which, the curve was 6% usage, the sweeper was 4%. So neither were used much at all. But if they're going to go to it, I would much rather see the sweeper. I think if there's a lefty up, I can hear the argument for going left or going curveball there and trying to bury it more down because the sweeper might just end up running in on him or staying up and kind of floating into the hitting zone. Like against lefties, I could probably see the curveball being the more oft used breaking ball if they want to go that way. But against righties, man, you got a chance to put some people away. He had some nice counts where he could have easily gone and thrown a sweeper to try and get a strikeout there. And it ended up being cutter most of the time. It just,
Mhm.
most of the time you were in those spots, they went to the cutter. And the very first batter of the game, he had hung a curveball in a 2-strike count. And I don't know if that scared off Contreras a little bit in terms of using the off speed. But again, I would have preferred the sweeper there anyway between the two. Um, but even still, like I feel like, and again, I don't want to make this a whole Contreras thing, but I do feel like sometimes he's more prone to almost remembering the mistakes on the off speed and kind of forgetting that, yeah, he's also doing that on a fastball that he's leaving over the heart of the plate because he seems hesitant to go back to a pitch after it gets hit if it's an off speed pitch. but he doesn't seem super hesitant to do that on fastball. So that's more eye test. I don't have any numbers to back that up, but that's something I've noticed over time, and it just feels like to me that's how it kind of goes. Either way, I'm fully with you. The four seam is a good pitch. I get the pairing of the four seam and the curveball and thinking like, okay, we can go high, almost like the Trevor McGill idea, right? Like we're going to go
Mhm.
four seam high, we're going to go hard curveball down. It's not the same type of curveball as McGill. It's not as hard, but you get the idea of it. Even still, that sweeper, it's a very, very good pitch. I know I agree with you that this feels like the way they're going, but I'm pretty confident in saying that it's just wrong. I don't think it's the right way to do it. The sweeper should be used. So I agree with you. Cutter, if he's starting, has to be in rotation. To me, that's like a 15% usage probably is where I
Yeah.
would like to
It
see it land.
it's
Like,
it's a bridge pitch. It kinda ties stuff together, but it shouldn't be a
yes,
major that pitch is not how you're getting guys out. That pitch is a way to if anything, it's to help get more chases on the sweeper because they're
right,
seeing something short glove side, and then you have to honor that, and
exactly.
then the sweeper gets more chase, but it's to help the sweeper, not to exclusively be like a significant fastball complement.
Right. And that's the thing. That was what was so frustrating was there were so many times that the cutter actually got like a foul ball on it. And it was like, "Oh, this is perfect. Like now you've got a
Yep, go
chance. You got two
longer.
strikes. He just fouled
Mhm.
one off. Now go sweeper." And it was either back to the fastball or even doubling up on the cutter. And it was like, I don't get that. And um, some of this may be, a little bit of an unfamiliarity, like I said, with Contreras in terms of how he would want to attack with a certain pitcher because he just doesn't know him that well. But even still, that one's more just like, okay, but that's just baseball. Like that makes sense. Like that's logic for anybody if they have this pitch mix to do something like that. So um it was weird. I agree with you too. I thought the line was not indicative of how Elvin pitched. Um, he was pretty close to getting out of that first inning and not having anything on the board. Um,
Mhm.
no offense to Yelich, but I think there's a pretty decent chance if Churio was in left, he would have caught that ball that Massey hit. And even the Renfro 2-run single was on a cutter, but it was kind of just flipped out there. It really wasn't hit very hard. So he got himself into a little trouble, but overall, I thought he looked pretty good. I actually felt like, okay, Elvin Rodriguez could make a couple more starts for me while we're trying to figure out this rotation and get healthy and everything. I'd feel comfortable throwing him out there for a couple more starts and preferably with a different pitch mix, and then we
Mhm.
see where it goes from there. But um, yeah, I like the stuff. I just do not like the way it was put into action.
And it's again, like, I was when they first signed him, I was kind of leaning towards hoping they'd push him into the reliever mold, but I had kind of a hunch they would go this route just because he can throw this many different pitches. And now that I've seen him in a game and like I think it can work. Like I'm okay with him getting another start. I'm comfortable with it. I think he could help them as a stretched out pitcher. And when I look at this arsenal, I see a role for each of these pitches. The fastball is going to be the centerpiece because it's a good fastball, the four seamer. The curveball, he got a lot of it doesn't grade out stuff-wise nearly as well as the sweeper, but it got a lot of rollovers because it's a very vertical
Hmm.
pitch. You get guys swing over the top of it. You need a ground ball, you have that in your back pocket, or you can throw that more to lefties, whatever. You got the sweeper. I think you can get some chase on that pitch, like, and just some swing and miss too, because it grades out
Hmm.
extremely well stuff-wise. Like, I think that is maybe not in terms of contribution to the arsenal, the fastball is probably still ahead of it, but just in terms of isolated stuff, I think it's the sweeper's his best pitch. Then that cutter's kind of a bridge pitch. It just ties everything together, gives you something you need to honor, and by honoring that pitch, the rest of it's gonna play up. Like, that's the way that I see this coming together, not throw 84% fastballs and barely show the breaking stuff. Like, to me, that it just feels like you're leaving something on the table. He's got the
Yes.
potential. He's got more tools in his tool belt, and you're just letting them sit there instead of letting them play. And that's what's a little bit frustrating. Again, it was only one outing, but seeing that after seeing the Yankees games and seeing that after seeing that was basically how he pitched in spring training as well, and it didn't work super great in spring training, like I don't know. It snowballs a little bit for me. I'm hoping that this changes, and maybe it does change pretty quickly. But knowing the Brewers, it just feels like they want the cutter to be a thing. And I think it should be in the arsenal, not in the way that they're seemingly thinking of it right now. So hopefully it
Yeah.
changes a little bit because I do think if you clean some of that up, I really I like the stuff here. I like the arsenal, and I can see a lot of what the Brewers saw here. So I think there's a path for him to get outs. They just this mix I think could take much better advantage of the things that he can
Mhm.
do well. And that's what I keep coming back to. So I think that's enough on that topic. One more thing we'll touch on really quick here on the pitching front. Abner Uribe looking really good in his first two outings, so that's always good to see coming off of his 4-game suspension. First appearances since almost a year ago in a regular season game. And what has stood out to me so far has been some of the sequences for him in a good way. We've talked before on the show about how we believe that the long term path for him for figuring it out at the big league level is, despite the velocity, to actually go pretty heavy slider and almost work guys backward. And that's how we really think the velocity can start to get guys because he's got a good slider.
Yeah.
And in his first outing, he came in that jam, and his first 3 pitches to Michael Garcia, whom he retired, were sliders. They worked backward there, and it worked. They got him. I love that sequence by Eric Haas, the way he called that. Came out in his second inning and was a lot more sinker heavy, but I think the way they mixed those started slider there worked really great for that at bat. So 9 sinkers, 4 sliders in that first outing. Then he came back on Wednesday and threw 7 sliders to 5 sinkers. And again, it worked. And I think you could see it in the swings. Guys looked pretty comfortable against his sinker last year.
Mhm.
On Wednesday, especially in some of these at bats where he was working them backwards, starting with the slider. Then when he dialed up the fastball, guys were way behind it. They could not get the barrel to that thing. And again, it's very early, but when these are the kind of things that we've been thinking about for a little bit, to just see even a taste of it, to get even a
Yeah.
taste of it, and to see it work, I hope that they're kind of going a little more in this direction. It's too soon to know if they are, but it stands out anyway because this is something we've been talking about, and I think you could see a difference in the swings with
Oh, yeah.
leaning more on the slider and going in reverse a little bit with how you were attacking some guys. So I'm hoping that this is something that they stick with, something to watch at the very least.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is the reasoning for me was always that I actually have always thought he commanded the slider better than his fastball. And so far, when they've gone to it, he's done a very good job of landing it in the zone or around the zone. But I always think back to Edwin Diaz, who kind of started taking this approach. Remember, he came up and he kind of lit
Mhm.
the world on fire for a year, and then he started getting hit. And obviously, Abner had a shorter path of like pitching really well, but he did pitch really well as a rookie. And then it was not going well last year. And then obviously everything else happened and he had the suspension, and then he hurt his knee and everything else. But Diaz reinvented himself by going very heavy to his slider and saying, okay, the off speed offering you're getting is a 100-mile-per-hour fastball. And the pitch you're seeing most often is a nasty 90-mile-per-hour slider. Good luck. And it's worked very, very well for him. And I think that's the path Abner should be taking. And today was the best glimpse of it because it was 7 out of 12 sliders. But yeah, man, the swings are not comfortable against the sinker. And we've talked about it a lot. The sinker is a pretty average, probably being generous shape. It's a pretty bad shape in reality. It's not a very good pitch. At times he gets more, into a true sinker where it's a little bit better. But there's a decent amount of the time where if you're looking at it, it's almost a dead zone pitch. Um, but when the slider's there, all of a sudden that makes it a lot harder for the hitter to be on time for that, to react to it. And that's what the velo does for him is it allows a not great shape to play up. But if all they're sitting on is the velo, it doesn't matter because MLB hitters are going to catch up to velo. It's the element of changing their timing, like we talked about a lot already on this episode, and the element of just doing something. I mean, using your really it's using your best pitch the most. That's part of it. And the pitch you command best the most. And then it's helping that pitch that really isn't that great on the surface become a much better pitch. So it's just always felt logically like the right way to go for them. And like you said, this is not a surefire sign that they are going to be doing this, but moving forward at least. But it's a nice glimpse at what it could look like if they do continue to go this way. And hopefully, from the Brewers' perspective, they also are recognizing that as it's playing out here. And hopefully that does continue to be the approach, because this is the best Abner's looked since like his first couple games with the Brewers, probably. Um, Hitters were not comfortable in either game against him.
Let's go rapid fire through some questions now. We'll start with
Yeah.
Lucas, who asked, it's only 6 games, but do the Brewers still need to make a move for a right-handed hitting bat that can play against left-handed pitching? JD Martinez, for example, is still a free agent. This is where I come back to our opening day roster projections and both of us feeling really confident that Mark Canha was going to make the roster. This is why we felt very confident that Mark Canha was going to make the roster, because yes, the Brewers have faced a lot of lefties early on here. There have been a lot of moments. In fact, you talked about one last week in New York. Moments
Mm-hmm.
of would have been really nice to have Mark Canha right now as that right-handed bat who can come off the bench. We can pinch hit him. He can come in, stay and play first. You can slide him into. I actually thought they could have used him on Wednesday against all these lefties. He could have stayed in and played like a corner outfield spot too,
Right.
after coming in
Yeah.
and hitting in a spot, because the Royals kept going to all of these lefty relievers. And I think it did hamstring Pat Murphy a little bit. We never saw Oliver Dunn pinch hit for Vinny
Mm-hmm.
Capra, even against right-handed pitching, presumably because Murphy knew they had all these lefties in the bullpen, and as soon as he pinch hits Ollie Dunn, you've now created this pocket of lefties that they're almost certainly going to exploit, if not in that moment, the next time that it comes through. So there have been a lot of spots where, yeah, Mark Canha would have been great to have. And that's why we thought he was going to make the roster, because I do think this roster needed a right-handed bat, another right-handed bat. Now, this is what really has me thinking that the Brewers cutting Canha, how much of that was they just think he might be done, that there's just
Right.
not a lot left in that bat. And if that's the case, I do understand it. It's hard to tell from spring training performance, because again, he only had 2 hits in spring training, but he's also never hit well in spring training. He was still getting on base. The plate discipline looked okay, but he is also getting to the he's crossed
Mm-hmm.
the upper side of the mid 30s. He's 36. So you never know. But just from a pure roster construction standpoint, yes, we both thought the Brewers were going to take the right-handed bat over Jake Bauers, but they ended up not going that way. So yes, I think they would be better off right now if they had another right-handed bat on that bench. I do think that's something they need. I don't think JD Martinez is a fit though, because he can't play the field anymore.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I think it is very funny, the first 2 series, just how many times it would have made a ton of sense for Mark Canha to be stepping in as a pinch hitter. I mean, it was uncanny.
Mhm.
Or even just, DHing in some of these starts. I mean, we've seen 4 lefty starters, and even honestly, that was part of the confusing part of it anyway. Like, you could have forecasted that the Brewers were going to see a ton of lefty starters to start the
Well,
year.
yeah,
You knew you were seeing Rodon and Fried. You knew you were going to see Reagans for sure in the second series, and most likely you were going to end up seeing a guy like Bubich. Like, that was almost a certainty. So even if you thought, yeah, we probably won't get a ton of value from him over the course of the season, like, you could have carried him for a week or two and just said, you know what, Perkins is out right now. That's a guy we would normally use as a righty against some lefties. Um, right now, let's carry Canha and keep him on the roster, and we'll find ways for him to hit. And I just remember, like, as Koenig was pitching to him today, he ended up drawing a walk. But I was thinking, I'm like, man, I don't like this matchup. Like, this is this is a lefty on the mound. Canha's just normally going to work a really good at bat here, and that was kind of how I was feeling in that moment. And it would have been nice to have that on our team, I guess. But I agree on Martinez. It it makes sense in the offensive form of things. It's just there's really no real spot for him, and he cannot play anywhere defensively.
Yeah, I keep coming back to what you said. Like the Brewers knew that they were going to have to deal with these matchups. So that's what kind of leads me back to that point of, did it
Right.
really just come down to, man, Mark Canha just does not look rosterable right now? Maybe that's
Yeah.
really what it was. Maybe they brought him in thinking that he was going to make the cut, and then they saw him in camp and they were like, "Ooh, this is not going to work."
Hmm.
And maybe they did know that that was going to put him in a tough spot early on, but they still felt that on the season Bowers would help them more. That almost certainly has to be what happened, because the Brewers aren't stupid.
Yeah.
It's just unfortunate that this is the spot they're in, because right now they absolutely would benefit from having another right-handed bat. Just from a roster construction standpoint. So unfortunate that this is where they are. We'll see what happens once they get through this stretch, and we'll kind of have to see how the dust settles. But yeah, it is something to pay attention to, and who knows, maybe they try to manipulate some more roster stuff. Maybe we see them promote a right-handed bat at some point. Not exactly sure where that would come from though, without optioning like an Isaac Collins, who's a switch hitter anyway. But a lot of season left. There are some things that they can do as the year goes on. Next question. This will be the fun one. Andrew asks if I can talk through my foul ball strategy in the press box. Jeff Levering and Lane Grindle didn't seem too impressed with your fishing net usage and form. How do you plan to improve? So let me sit up in my chair first before I try to walk through this whole situation here. Here's the full story of the press box net. So I'm going to take you back to last September. The Brewers are playing the Cardinals at home, and Yoel Payamps is on the mound. There's a foul ball hit straight back toward the press box, and it hits my laptop. My laptop goes flying. Somehow it was completely okay. I picked it up and I was expecting the screen to be broken. Nothing. Completely okay. Just a nice little mark on the laptop shell that I have placed over the top of it. So a nice little symbol there. A few minutes later, the Brewers are batting in the bottom half of the inning, and Blake Perkins hits a screamer once again directly back at me. I duck again, and this one was hit hard enough that not only did it leave like an indent in the press box wall right behind where my head was before I ducked, it actually went through the wall, and there's a full on hole in there, and it's still there to this day. So obviously I was a little bit rattled after that one, seeing that screamer come in. I already had a buddy texting me telling me that I should have caught that one, but that was not going to go well for me. So in light of those two events occurring in relatively short order, I come back to the press box the next day to find that my neighbor to my left, Andrew Wagner of Forbes Sports, has purchased a $6 cruddy fishing net to place in the press box right behind me so that I have something to defend myself. And it was pretty funny, actually. It was just kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke, a little bit of a gag gift. But he bought like a command hook and everything too, like a command strip hook. So we had it mounted on the press box wall right behind me for the rest of the season and into the playoffs. And we came back this year for the home opener. The hook was still there. He brought the net back, so everything was still business as usual. For the most part, we just leave it hanging up there just as kind of a joke, just a fun reminder. But today, as we started seeing some more foul balls hit, kind of working their way back toward our area, I decided, if we have this net here, I might as well try to use it at some point. And if it's sitting on the hook behind me, I'm not going to have time to grab it if a foul ball's hit, have a chance to catch it. So I pulled it off the hook. I have it sitting on the desk. I don't know if I'd call it a desk, just kind of that press row, if you want to call it. I have it sitting out in front of me, like right next to my laptop. And this is actually when you started texting me. You said Jeff and Lane noticed it, and they were talking about how I appeared to have a fishing net sitting next to me. So it's sitting there. And I'll also say, too, like there's a limited subset of foul balls that I can actually try to catch with that thing. If somebody hits a screamer right back at me, like that Perkins line drive, I'm not trying to catch that in the $6 fishing net, because I don't think that thing's going to hold up. I think the ball's probably just going to scream right through that thing and rip a hole in the back of it. And then, we're in no safer of a situation than we were when we first started. So I'm not going to try that. It needs to be like a looping foul ball that comes back and it's kind of got some arc to it, and I got a chance to reach over and just scoop it with the net. And that's what happened. Foul ball hit back my way. I've got the net sitting there. I pick it up. Granted, I was probably like 1 second too late or half a second too late in realizing this is one that I could go for. So I was a little bit behind the 8 ball from the start. But I grabbed the net, I tracked it, I reached out of the press box, and because of the arc of the ball and because of the fact that I was sitting down, so I was not in a very great fielding position to begin with here. As that arc of the ball starts to take effect, at the last second, it left my sight line because it dipped too low. So think of this, I'm sitting in the press box, and if it's starting to dip below the window of the press box, it's out of my line of sight now at the last second. So I didn't reach out far enough. It clanked off the front of the net and went back down into the concourse. I'm not using that as an excuse. I should have caught it. I should have been in a better position. It's my fault. I deserve all the heat that I caught for the rest of this game, both from the broadcast and from my colleagues on press row. It's my bad. I got to do a better job moving forward. So I think that's going to have to be the strategy, though. I might have to stand up as it's coming in case I need to really lean out that window, because I think that's what did me in. Number one, probably not great reaction time on my part, but number two, being seated meant that I didn't have a lot of range of motion. I couldn't lean out as far as I needed to. So I think that's going to be the strategy moving forward. I really hope I get a chance to redeem myself, because that one's going to haunt me for at least the rest of the season if I don't get a chance to correct it.
Yeah, this was hilarious to me because I was watching the game, but then I had to go grab some lunch, so I'm listening to it in the car, and all of a sudden I'm pulling up to where I'm going to grab lunch, and all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, it looks like young Jack Stern over there has got a fishing net," and they obviously had not seen the fishing net before the way they were talking about it, or they hadn't
Oh
noticed
no,
it before.
it's been there for quite a while though. This
Yeah.
is not anything new.
Yeah, well, they had not noticed it in the past, so, they're talking about it, and no joke, it's one pitch later that they go, "Oh, there's a ball going right towards him," and, they're like, "Jack's reaching." No, and he clanked it, and he's like, "Oh, and he's hearing about it now," and and
I
the
was hearing
media
about it.
from the other ones, and, yeah, it was very funny to listen to just in the moment, like, okay, they just noticed this, and now there's a ball hit directly to him. So it was great to get an even further play-by-play. I mean, you went deep on that, and I respect your candidness. I really
Mhm.
appreciate the fact that you took responsibility for not making the play, because that's how it should be. You gotta make the plays when they're in front
Oh
of
yeah,
you, and
it was a routine play. I should have made it. No excuses. Again, I
yeah,
offered the full explanation of what happened, but that's not an excuse. I
yeah,
should have
no,
made the
I
play, should have been in a better position, should have left my seat. I mean, it was a can of corn. That ball was not hit very hard. It had the right arc. Like, there's a play I should have made. Full
yeah. Well,
accountability. I'll try not to let it happen again.
I'm sure everyone appreciates that, and that'll people are gonna sleep better at night tomorrow after they hear this, because it's not coming out today, but they'll sleep better at night. It's gonna be a rough night tonight for a lot of people, I'm sure, but they'll sleep a lot better
I'm
on Thursday night, though. Now,
I'm hoping I can get the fans and my fellow media members to kind of rally around me too. I could use a little bit of support here.
well, I did hear people calling you Jack Bill Buckner Stern, so it's gonna take a while, but we'll figure it out.
All fun and games up in the press box. Always a good time. Mason, to switch gears, asked us about Mark Ananasio making a comment at Carroll University today. So he was speaking there this afternoon. And he said that he had spoken to Scott Boras in recent days, and one of his clients will be throwing a bullpen for the Brewers to watch. Any ideas on who it might be? It's got to be Spencer Turnbull, right?
Yeah, that's my guess. I was also just, for a fun one, hoping. I don't know if Joey Gallo is a Scott Boras client, but that would be sick if we were getting a Gallo pitching performance for the Brewers. It would be a minor league deal. It'd be nothing that would actually impact the Brewers right away. But he seems like someone who'd be a Boras client, and I would enjoy that one. But in terms of actual major league, like somebody who might help the major league team, Turnbull would make a ton of sense. And I had him on my offseason plan for the Brewers, so
We
I'd be
did.
fully
Or
on
you did.
board. Yeah.
You did, because I was
Yeah,
gonna
no,
throw
I
him
know.
on mine too. I was gonna throw him on mine, but I couldn't fit him in the budget. That's what kinda went south there.
Yeah,
But yeah, I was mildly surprised that he wasn't, and maybe the Brewers did try to go after him over the winter, I don't know, but I was mildly surprised that, yeah, he didn't end up with them. Eventually, they went with Tyler Alexander to kind of fill that role, but I thought just in terms of the arsenal, the fact that he's bounced around between starting and relieving, I thought that that was a guy who would kind of fit a flex role very well for them. So it wouldn't be
yeah,
shocking if that's who they're talking to right now.
no, not at all.
We have another Mason who asked us a different question. This is a big week for Masons. Other Mason asked us, what is the Brewers' philosophy on stretching guys out? To me, it seems like they slow play the process more than other teams. 2 years in a row, we've entered the season with innings concerns. Is that more so because we've targeted swingman types, or is it approach? I mean, it's also just injuries, a
Yeah,
big part of it too. I mean, they stretched out Elvin, they stretched out Alexander, they stretched out Thomas a little bit. This might sound like me making excuses for them, but I'm kind of struggling to think of better ways that they could have played this situation, because not only did you have those guys, even if you don't count those guys, how many deep were you in this rotation at the start of spring training? You didn't have Quintana yet, but you were in the mix for him at that point. But you went into spring training with Freddie, Nestor, Tobias, Savali, DL Hall, Aaron Ashby, Chad Patrick, and then get further down your depth chart. You got your Logan Henderson and those kind of guys. Like, and
yeah,
then you round it out with the guys who you're also still stretching out. Like you're about 10 deep in that rotation mix. And to have that many guys go down in that short of an amount of time, and then to bring in Quintana and not quite able to build up maybe as quickly as some of us thought he would have been able to. I don't know. I don't think there's anything out of the ordinary with the way they play this, especially in today's day and age with teams in general are just a little more careful with this kind of stuff. I think you could actually argue that the Brewers sometimes hit the gas a little harder when they need certain guys in the bullpen to fill innings. Like Grant Anderson threw quite a few pitches a couple days ago.
hmm
Was Paguero's covered multiple innings so far in multiple outings to begin the season, or he's gone multiple ups. He hasn't covered 2 full innings in both appearances, but they've I I don't know. I don't think they're necessarily slow playing it relative to other teams. And I mean, again, like you got Elvin stretched out to 80 pitches, and you're probably going to be in a similar spot with Alexander. Like Connor Thomas is in a spot where he can throw 60 pitches in an outing, if not a little more. I don't think there's anything that they've done that has really created an innings concern that didn't need to exist.
yeah, I'm with you. I I don't know. You can't start. You can't have like everybody building up in spring just because of like you have to keep guys on schedules too. So
Mhm.
that's going to be part of it. And you're trying to make sure you get innings for certain people, and you also need people to get used to a bullpen role as well. Like some of these guys, like an Elvin Rodriguez or not necessarily Patrick. Patrick was being stretched to start the whole time because he was most likely going to be in AAA. Um, but a Thomas and those types, like they have to be used to coming out of the pen. And then you also have to get like 4 other relievers ready that day and stuff like it. It just, you can't stretch everybody. So they do what they can. And they try and give themselves some options to work with. Like last year, Bryce Wilson he had been stretched somewhat in spring so that if they needed him to make starts, he could kind of build up quick enough to go like, okay, he can go 4 innings the first time we use him, 3 innings to 4 innings. And then after a while, he was able to go, okay, yeah, if he's pitching well, we could go 5 or even 6 a couple times, which was a surprise at the time, but he was able to do it. So, yeah, I think they handle it fine. And like Jack said, there were just so many injuries this spring that there's just no way they could have been prepared for it.
Yeah, and I mean, like you're still you are within the confines of a 40-man roster and then a 26-man roster, and how all
Yeah.
those moving parts are going to work. Like there really is no way that you can fully plan to address that many injuries in that short of a stretch of time, just with the way that building a roster works and the possibilities, the multiple possibilities that you need to be prepared for. There really is no way to do it. So I don't think they really did anything on this front that was, number one, out of the ordinary, and number two, that artificially created a bad situation. He did ask a follow up about Patrick specifically. He said, I also understand injuries happen. I'm not saying the process is right or wrong, just trying to gain an understanding. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Chad Patrick, for example, seemed like he was much more confident and comfortable as a starter. Feels like he should have just had the green light to start. I think that was more about they needed him to be available in relief if
Yeah.
that was the more pressing need. And they actually did keep him on his starting schedule. So I don't think they really did anything to pull him out of his comfort zone too much. I'm sure if you asked him, he probably would have preferred to start his first big league game as opposed to having to get ready a little quicker and come out of the bullpen. But I believe he's pitched in relief in the minors before too, so
Oh
that's
yeah.
not
Yeah.
entirely foreign to him. And again, what matters more is that they kept him on his schedule, and they did that. So again, I think they're just trying to work as best they can with what they have, and it's when you have this many guys go down, you're never going to be in an ideal spot. Now, I will say, I think Murph has kind of, for as rough as the injury situation has been, he has been kind of bordering on using it as a very, very serious excuse for things. Like I was Murph will tell things like they are more than some other managers, but I was pretty surprised when we got to the home opener and I asked him a question about the status of the bullpen, and he said, "It's scary. We're decimated." And then he said it again post game after they gave up 11 runs. Well, we're decimated. Man, like I get it, but it's always not the best look to come out and almost use that as a blanket excuse for anything that happens. Like to me, it's not an excuse for giving up 11 runs to Kansas City. Like that's Grant Anderson was ready to go. He should have pitched better than he did. Pitch
Hmm.
mix for Elvis could have been a little, or Elvin could have been a little different, like we talked about. Like, okay, yes, I understand you're in a tough spot, and they really are limited in how much they can do to prepare for this. But at the same time, like acting like there's just no way that you can make this work, which was he never came out and said that, but just the way that he was really leaning into that, it did irk me a little bit. I think he went a little overboard on just how much he played into that, and it almost borders a little bit too on, man, wouldn't it just be better to say like, well, yes, we're in a tough spot, but I think we have some guys here who can help us get through it, as opposed to just saying we're decimated, like almost saying we're screwed.
Yeah.
I think you're trending a little bit too far in that direction. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of how they've used guys, they're doing the best they can with what they've got right now.
Yeah. 100% agree.
Tyler asked us any concerns with Brian Hudson's fastball velo being back in the high 80s again in the home opener. I mean, he's just kind of been all over the map now. Even in that outing, I think he got up to at least 92. There might have been a 93 in there. And even in spring, I saw some outings where he'd be 94 and then the next one's 88. So I don't know. He's just kind of all over the map right now. Again, we've kind of touched on it a little bit. I'm at a point where this might just be where he's going to be.
Yeah.
It's probably just not getting better than this. So now the focus shifts to how do you make things work with what he's got, and I think they're going to find ways to do that. But yeah, I'm almost kind of past the point of Brian Hudson velo watch. I'm more at the point of acceptance of like he's not gonna. I don't expect him to ever sit 92 to 93 again. I don't think that's coming back. I think
Yeah.
he can reach. I think he can reach back for it. I don't think he's going to sit there though.
Right. Yeah. I don't think we will see a run of the exact same type of stuff we saw for 2 months last year. I don't think that's coming, but I think there is, like you said, they can use the changeup and the sinker that he's added, and um, the stuff can still play, especially with his arm
Yeah,
slot and his
yeah, he's still
extension
very
and everything
deceptive.
else. He's still got a lot of things going for him. So he's been a little all over the place command wise too in the first couple outings, which he's always going to be a little iffy on command, but he'll need to lock that in a little bit more, especially if the velo is not going to be
Yeah,
there, which I agree. I don't think it will be.
and that's a tough delivery to repeat too. So not
Oh yeah.
surprising that he's dealing with that right now. It's probably going to come up at times in the future. Brewers are just gonna he and the Brewers are gonna have to find a way to make it work with what he's got right now, and it seems like with adding those additional pitches, like they're trying, and
Mhm.
I don't think he's going to be a dominant reliever this year, but I think he's still gonna be a very solid middle relief type guy who could pitch and leverage in the right matchups, can eat some innings out of it. Like, he's still gonna be a pretty valuable piece for them this year.
Yeah.
Even if you look at his peripherals from last year, like, he was I believe every run he gave up last year was via the home run too. He had like a 94% left on base rate, and I think the one guy who he did not leave on base scored because he gave up a home run. I mean, he had like a 157 BABIP or something. So that's just not repeatable no matter how good you are. So and his FIP was like around 3 or 3.5, wherever it was at. So I think just all these factors combined, he's probably gonna look the numbers are probably gonna look a lot more like that of just kind of a run of the mill, more average middle relief guy than what we saw
Yeah.
last year. And that doesn't even necessarily need to be tied to where the fastball's at. But still a good question. That's kind of where I'm at on it now. We'll move on to Beer Cheese Benny, who asks about the offense. He said the Brewers seem to be late on so many pitches, awful approaches too. And then what two players do you see turning it around and getting hot? Spence, you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I mean, I think the approaches, I don't know if I'm super on board with that take, but I get it. There's been some pretty ugly at bats, so I get it. But in terms of two players I see turning it around, one, William Contreras is going to hit better than he is right now. I mean, I don't think there's any question in my mind that he's going to get hot here soon um and start hitting. I mean, he's too good of a hitter for him to look like he has so far. And the other one I'll go with is gonna be Rhys Hoskins. I actually think he's had, for the most part, pretty good at bats. He's hit the ball hard, pretty decent amount. It has been low liners or grounders, though, so need to see him start to elevate those a little bit more. But he's walked quite a bit. I think he struck out twice today, but the strikeouts have been in a pretty decent spot overall for especially a guy like him. So I actually think his process has been pretty solid so far, and that he's going to just start getting some better results as he goes forward here. So those will be my two picks. But at the same time, I mean, guys like Yelich and Churio's numbers probably are better than Yelich's right now, but I think both of those are obviously going to get hot too. I just think based on process, especially Reese is one I wanted to point out.
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple guys who I think are going to hit better than they have so far. Whether that's, I mean, you could pick just about the entire top of the lineup if you really wanted
Yes.
to. Um, Contreras, Churio, Yelich, Hoskins. Again, I have concerns about this offense, but you already have quite a few guys toward the top, at least, who are going to be carrying their weight quite a bit more than they have so far. So I don't think that's really a concern. It's very early. Rough at bats can look even rougher at this stage of the season. Next question comes from Will, who asks about the outlook of the pitching when the Brewers start to get to full health a little bit more. He asks, what do you think the Brewers will do with the pitching staff come May when they get Myers, Quintana, Mears, Woodruff, and Aaron Savali back? Who goes down to make room for these guys? If Chad Patrick can be this year's version of Tobias Myers, can you afford to send him down? What happens when Hall and Ashby come back? A lot of stuff going on there. I guess first, you can't necessarily assume that there aren't going to be more injuries by the
Yeah.
time that these guys are ready to come back. That's always something to think about as well. As far as kind of to take the back end of that question, Aaron Ashby and DL Hall can still be sent back down to the minor leagues. They have
Hmm.
options left, so they don't need to roster those guys when they're ready. So they have a little bit of flexibility there as well that they can exercise with those guys. Probably going to have to use a Patrick option depending on kind of the status of the rest of your rotation, which again, he's made one start. It was a very solid start, but it was one start. You don't know for sure what you're getting from him at this point.
Yeah.
And also to be this year's Tobias Myers, there needs to be the opportunity. Tobias Myers took off because they needed him to pitch. If they were at full health, Tobias Myers actually probably spends a lot of the year back in Nashville after he got sent down the first or second time. In
Yep.
fact, at the time that he came back up for good, we were both saying that he didn't look quite ready yet. We thought he needed more seasoning in AAA. but he just had to be plugged back into that rotation out of necessity, and that's when he kind of took off. So the opportunity needs to be there for him to take that route, which is almost certainly going to be dependent on the health of a lot of these other pitchers. So they can use his option. If it gets to that point, they will. Hall and Ashby can still be sent down. You have enough moving pieces here that I think it's fairly straightforward who's going to not be on the roster if there aren't spots. It's going to be the guys who have options left. So I don't think there's anything crazy there. And again, you have to also account for the fact that maybe there are going to be other guys who go down with injury around the time that these guys come back. These things tend to work themselves out. I have no doubt that that's going to be how it plays out this year as well.
Yeah, I don't have much to add there. I think there's a lot that can happen in the next month or so. I mean, even they're all technically kind of coming back in May, but these are all pretty different timelines. Like Myers and Quintana could be, and Mears could all be quite a bit earlier than Woodruff. They will be, I should say, and barring a setback or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And well, and that's also part of the equation. There could be setbacks involved for all of these guys. And there's so many moving parts. It's really hard to answer too far into the future on stuff like that. But like Jack said, the Brewers do have quite a few optionable guys. This is kind of part of the reason I was banging the table to make sure we didn't waste the DL Hall option year at the end of last season. So I'm very glad that he does have this one option year left, because it does give them some flexibility, and especially coming off injury, him being able to go to Nashville and maybe rev things up there a little bit more than having to be able to go right away in MLB should be helpful. So a lot of moving parts. We'll just have to kind of see how it shakes out and how Patrick's performing and how everyone else is performing in their opportunities. And, maybe Elvin Rodriguez is making so many good starts that it's like, well, we're not going to put Hall over Elvin. We're going to keep Elvin as the fifth starter right now. So there's just a lot of stuff that can happen until then. So we'll just have to see how it plays out.
Final question this week comes from Nate, who asks, what the heck is a balk? So the context for this one, in Game 3 against the Royals, Carlos Estevez was called for a balk in the 10th inning, and I never watched the full replay. I'm not quite sure what it is. I know you looked at it more. You're not quite sure what it is either. You have a thought on maybe what they perceive to be illegal movement after he came set without delivering a pitch, because that's what a balk is. It's illegal movement that does not result in you going to the plate and delivering a pitch, because the rule is set up so that basically if you're doing anything that they think could deceive a base runner into taking off, it's meant to prevent like those kinds of pickoffs and those kinds of caught stealings, to avoid an unfavorable advantage for the pitcher there, to almost deke a runner when he's leading off the base.
Yeah, in watching the replay and then also kind of reading the Royals manager's lips a little bit when he came out, I think what he called was Estevez taking like a quick hard look to second base. And I think what the umpire was seeing was he like moved his upper body or something, which they didn't show super up close. So it was kind of hard to tell if maybe that did budge a little bit in the shoulders or in the upper half. But you could read the manager's lips when he came out. He's just looking at second base. He's looking at second base. So I think he made kind of a hard head turn towards second base. And I don't know if the body moved along with it or what, but I think that's what triggered it, and that's what John Tom Payne saw when he made the balk call. So it didn't look like a balk to me. I don't think it was a balk. I guess good news in terms of, having to hear about it all week. The Brewers did not take advantage of that opportunity at all. So we didn't have to worry about Royals fans blaming the loss on that one, I guess. But it looked like the wrong call to me. So it was just a kind of a weird situation. A guy making a call that I just don't think was really there.
Want to jump into your minor league sandbox to close us out?
Oh, of course I do.
All right, take it away.
All right. We will quickly just talk about Nashville, and then we'll jump into some of the other rosters because they all came out this week finally. So Nashville struggling out of the gates a little bit similar to the Brewers. They are now they have 1 win so far this season, and they have a team strikeout rate of 33.5% on the offensive side. So things are not going well offensively in those first 5 games. But one bit of good news: Jacob Misiorowski shoved in his debut this year. 5 shutout innings, 7 strikeouts, 1 hit, walked 3, but for Miz, that's 3 walks in 5 innings. Isn't that bad? So, I mean, he looked really good to me, and I talked about it in spring, but I know the results weren't there in spring. He looks like he's got a cleaner delivery, that he's more sturdy with his delivery, that it's more repeatable. I'm not going to do a victory lap after one start because there's a lot of stuff that I want to see still, but that was a good step in the right direction for him. Hopefully this is something that we continue to see over the course of, at least a few more starts. And then if we do, I think that's when you start thinking about, okay, maybe Miz is actually capable of making some starts for the Brewers this year. But after one, we're not going to go quite that far. But the stuff did look good. And I do think he's kind of moved. It's been trending this way, but I think he's moved his slider into basically being like a true cutter at this point. He even threw one at 96 in this game with still a decent amount of horizontal movement to it, especially visually. But it was a pretty good pitch, and he was sitting in that like 93 to 94 range with it for the most part. But yeah, got up all the way to 96 with it. So the curveball is such a good breaking ball. I don't think he needs a true slider. And it seems like he can command that cutter better. So I like it. I like the change, and I hope it helps him get in the zone even more, or not even more consistently, much more consistently. And in game one, it seemed to be the case. So on the not so great news in terms of Nashville, Jefferson Cairo is going to be out for a few more weeks. He came up with a little bit of a hamstring injury per Andrew Wagner. He's going to report to Nashville once he's there, though. I know he had been assigned to Biloxi at one point, and that had caused a little bit of confusion for myself and a number of people. But it sounds like he is going to be assigned to Nashville once he is fully healthy. So moving on to our other part here, and that's just going to be talking a little bit about the rosters that were released for the other 3 levels. I'm not going to touch on everybody, but we'll hit on some highlights quickly. Carolina, starting with low A, Carolina, probably the team I'll be watching the most this year, if I had to guess, or at least at the beginning of this year. Jesus Mate did end up getting assigned there, as did Luis Pena. 2 teenagers, 18-year-old Pena, 17-year-old Mate for the next couple of months still. Going to be just an electric middle infield to watch, especially, Pena will probably play some third, Mate will play some third, but they'll probably just be covering all 3 infield spots. And then to fill out the infield, they also have one of my favorites, Josh Adamszewski, and then Eric Batanti will play a lot of first base, I would imagine, with this overall lineup. But that's not even to mention the other 2 infielders who are both legitimate prospect noteworthy types of players, Filippo Dituri and Luyen Alastre, 2 guys who I find interesting in different ways. Dituri's very hit tool, slappy type of guy, but he plays solid defense. He's got some speed, just an overall kind of solid baseball player. And then Alastre, similar, but has a little more pop, maybe a little bit more of like a gap-to-gap power guy. He can put one over the fence, unlike Dituri at the moment, but very, very fun infield. Braylon Payne in the outfield, last year's first-round pick. One of my favorites from last year, Marco Dinges behind the plate. Very, very fun position player group. On the pitching side, they have Bryce Message, last year's second-round pick out of high school. And the name that everyone is talking about, and I've mentioned a number of times, so I won't go through much here, but Jack Hostetler, undrafted guy out of a D3, who is now pretty legitimate prospect, who has been up to 99 in spring and throwing some pretty nasty sliders as well as a decent changeup. And he has also been mixing all 3 different fastballs, it sounds like. So very, very fun name to watch. I assume he's going to be starting, but I have no idea. Wandy Torres is another name to watch. Travis Smith, Sam Garcia, John Holibet's, all draft picks from last year. Miles Langhorn, another interesting undrafted guy from last year. But that's the Mudcats roster. That's going to be a really, really fun one to follow. T-Rats roster, somebody I'm sure people listening are most interested in this one, as this is the one a lot of you will probably be able to go out and attend a game if you choose to do so. So Yoferi Rodriguez probably highlights the position player group. One of the top 10 prospects in the system. Very, very young still 19 years old. Made it to high A for the playoffs last year. Just a fun bat, good athlete, very solid defender. Probably not the fastest guy in the world in the outfield, but gets very solid reads and strong jumps and routes for a guy his age. Outfield otherwise is some interesting names: Hedbert Perez, Luis Castillo, Yosar Garcia. On the infield, names to know: Juan Baez, Blake Burke, and Yadier Arianamo. All legitimate top 30 prospects by at least one publication. Burke has huge power at first base out of Tennessee. Very, very fun bat. Be curious to see if he moves to Double A quickly. But when we get to the Shuckers roster, you will see that the infield is very full at Double A as well. Very common theme here in the minors. The Brewers infield is full of noteworthy prospects. It'll be interesting to see if they end up making any trades throughout the season, just kind of dealing from some of that depth, because there is a ton of infield talent right now. Interesting name at the catcher spot, Edgardo Ordonez. He skipped low A here. He had a 128 WRC plus in the ACL last year. Not really talked about much, but he's only 21 years old. He'll be 21 all season. He's thrown out base runners at a decent clip, and he performed really well in the ACL last year. Now they're skipping him over low A. So will be interesting to see if he gets legitimate playing time there, or if he's more of a roster filler, which they do sometimes with catchers, but he keeps performing. So we will see where he ends up. On the pitching side, favorite of mine, Dikembe Sanchez, I've talked about a lot. Bishop Letson is going to be the one that I really want to go out and see in person at some point. Tyson Harden, very fun name from spring, who's added 3 pitches from his college days already. Chandler Welch is one of my favorite picks from last year. Ryan Burchard has really good stuff. Yerlin Rodriguez can get up into the triple digits on his fastball out of the pen. Manuel Rodriguez had a walk. I believe he had the lowest walk rate in all of minor league baseball last year as a pitcher. So a lot of fun names there on the pitching side as well. I'm not even touching on a lot of them. And wrapping up with the Double-A Shuckers roster. Again, infield is loaded. Luke Adams, one of my personal favorites. Brock Wilken coming off of his eye issue, hopefully going to have a nice bounce back season here. Headliner, obviously, Cooper Pratt, making it to Double-A and beginning the year at Double-A at his age. Very exciting. Pretty easily a top 3 prospect by every measure now in the system. He showed some more power in spring than we had seen, 108 mile per hour homer, which we had not seen any homers that had left the bat at that level of exit velocity yet this year, or in his career so far. So really nice to see there. And then you have former first round pick Eric Brown Jr., who also spent decent amount of time in the outfield in spring training. He'll probably play second base and then play some center, some left, move around the outfield as well. I'm sure they're going to continue to try and get him at bats. Luis Lara is the name to know in the outfield. Very young, been continued to get pushed. Physically looks like he's in a really good spot right now in spring. Thought he looked like he was much stronger, but also just in a better place with his swing. And we will see if he can handle Double-A. He didn't have a great year in high A, but I liked what I saw in spring. On the pitching side, the main name to know is going to be Casey Hunt. Very obviously had a great season as an undrafted free agent the year before. Made it all the way to Double-A. Performed at Double-A just as well as he had at every other level. Think if you see him do that again for a couple of months, pretty good chance you see him in Nashville by midseason. But he's a very fun one to watch. Breaking balls for days. Solid fastball shape, even though the velo's not great. So super fun one there. Tate Keener's the other starter on the list that is worth watching, I would say. But Brett Witrowski and Coleman Crow, who are not on the roster listed right now, are just in extended spring training, continuing to build up. So we will see them at some point, and those are 2 Fun pitcher names to know, obviously. Wichrowski had a huge blow up during spring last year and really burst onto the scene, the prospect scene. And then Coleman Crow was acquired in the Adrian Hauser, Tyrone Taylor trade. Injured, coming off Tommy John, didn't look great in the AFL, but coming off of the injury now, a little more time to kind of build up and see how he looks in like 8 months removed from the surgery now, or from starting back on a mound now. And then the other thing with them is that they just have a very, very fun bullpen. Nick Merkel, Justin Yeager, Mark Manfredi's interesting. Chase Costello's kind of like the poor man's. Craig Yoho with the changeup. Will Childers is a very fun name. I've talked about Tyler Bryant. I really, really like his stuff. It's a Alexander Corniel is a really fun name too. He'll probably be starting to start the year, but he's a still relatively young dude who was performing pretty well in high A as well. So lots of fun names at every level here. I tweeted this, but there's really no soft spot in the organization. I think you could maybe argue Nashville is right now. But even then, you have guys like Jacob Mizorowski, Logan Henderson, Jefferson Cairo's going to be there. Tyler Black will be there when he's healthy. Ernesto Martinez is just fun to watch every time he's on the field. So you can turn on a game and find fun Brewers minor league talent at any level. And that's exciting. It's fun to not have to worry about at any point having to deal with just a random crappy team, because I've seen that before. Biloxi has been that a couple times. They tend to skip some of the talent over Biloxi at times, but this year I'll happily turn on any of these affiliates and watch a game, and it'll be hard not to see something exciting from a top prospect by some measure. So yeah, Jack, you can wrap this up, but minor league baseball starts for real on Friday this week, because that's when all of the other levels start. And you can bet when I have time, I will be watching them. I'll be tweeting about them. I'll be tweeting videos. I'm going to try to be on the Brewer Fanatic forums more. I made a promise that I would try to be on the forums more for these games, because there is always a good game thread talking about all 3-4 games. When we get to the ACL games, there's an extra one. DSL games are going to be discussed in there. So if you haven't checked out the minor league forum for that stuff, you should go over there and check it out. There's a lot of people who join the major league forums, which is great, but the minor league forum is where all the real true nerds like to hang out. So it's a great little tight knit community there. And like I said, I'm going to do my best to be in there more, talking about the games and bring in whatever we can. It's always fun to discuss with the people in those game threads. So yeah.
Look at you engaging with the community.
That's right.
Promoting the community. A social guy. That's what I always say.
Mm-hmm.
That'll do it for us this week on the Brewer Fanatic podcast. This was a long one, so if you guys hung in there for the entirety of the runtime, give yourself a pat on the back, maybe a gold star. We'll try not to go as long every week, but a lot of stuff to talk about, I think, on the front end of the season, especially when you're talking about new trends that we might be seeing, things that we want to keep watching as the season progresses. We'll see how that season progresses, like we talked about before. I think the Brewers may have dodged a little bit of a potentially not so great fate by managing to claw back and win a couple here to close out the first home series. The homestand will continue with a 4-gamer against the Reds that begins on Thursday night and runs through the weekend. So we'll be back with all of that action, as well as some initial returns on the Brewers' first full road trip coming up after that. We'll be back with you next Friday. We dropped this one on Thursday based on scheduling and the way things all shook out, I should say. Shaked is not a word. That was awful grammar on my part. So that's a great note to close on.
2 hours into.
I can't catch foul balls with a fishnet, nor can I articulate the proper past tense of the word shake. So on that note, thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back with you next week.